I always wait till the end, see, and then when it's really, really quiet and it fades out, and then I start talking, then we'll get it going.
Okay.
So I'll just keep waiting. No, I'm kidding. I know we're live. Welcome, everybody, to the Atheist Experience. I'm your host, Matt Dillahunty. Joining me this week, Tracie Harris. We are live. It's Sunday, September 2nd, 2007. We're sponsored by the Atheist Community of Austin, a nonprofit educational organization promoting positive atheism and the separation of church and state. The ACA has weekly meetings every Sunday, starting this Sunday, actually, at Romeo's on Barton Springs Road. That begins at 11 o'clock. It's open to any atheist or atheist-friendly person who wants to come down and join us. On the second Sunday of the month, or actually on the first Sunday of the month, we host a lecture series. But this month for September, it's been moved to the second Sunday of the month. That's at the Austin History Center, located at the corner of 9th and Guadalupe. And this month's lecturer is Mark Lowy, who's going to be delivering a lecture on low-cost textbooks, incorrect tax scores, and progressive voucher systems. That'll be next Sunday at the Austin History Center at 12:15. The building opens around 12 o'clock, so you don't try to get down there too early. Lecture will start around 12:15 and 12:30. That's also open to the public as well. It's one of the many services we do. The audio portion of this program is available for download at the website, and the video portion is now available for download and viewing at Google. So if you go to the ACA website, atheist-community.org, which is at the bottom of your screen now, go to the flagship opportunities, click on the television program, you get to that page, or you can just go to atheist-experience.com. There'll be a link there for the show archives. Down in the archives at the bottom of the page, you can download the MP3 OGG Vorbis, and the video link is down there as well. So you can watch online. If you want to get in touch with us, you can email tv@atheist-community.org. That goes to myself, the co-host, some of the people behind the scenes. We can't promise to answer every email, but we do read all of them. Any comments, feedback, criticisms, questions, if you're a theist wanting a discussion or a debate, feel free to email us. I'm pretty sure that won't last nearly as long as you promised that it will last, but that's a little unfair. We were having a discussion before the show starts about a couple of email discussions that kind of just petered out and people disappeared, but that's fine as well. In addition to this program, the ACA also sponsors a bi-weekly internet audio podcast called The Nonprofits. That's PROPHETS. We will be live again this coming Saturday from 2 to 3:30 Central Time. We do not take phone calls during that show. We do during this one. That show is primarily geared at atheists. We run a chat room in conjunction with the show, and so that people can interact with us a little bit. This show, as I said, does take phone calls. We'll have the phone number for you shortly. It's a chance for atheists in the Austin area to interact with the public, to kind of alleviate some misperceptions about atheism, talk about what we believe, what you believe, what we don't believe, what you don't believe, social and political issues that are affecting all of us, and the role that religion plays in that, kind of as a forum for public discussion, debate, anything you want to know. For some of the more general questions that we get asked frequently, you're free to call in and ask them, and we'll do our best to answer them, but we don't want to spend a lot of time each show going over the same question over and over again. So we have a frequently asked questions portion on the website. If you go to atheist-community.org, you'll find the page there as well. We may direct you to that. It answers lots of simple questions like, what do atheists believe? What don't you believe? Isn't your life just meaningless without God? That type of thing. So the ACA, in addition to the various media opportunities, also hosts a number of social events throughout the week. In addition to the Sunday morning breakfast, the cast and crew of the show get together and go to IHOP after the show. That's the IHOP at I-35 and Cesar Chavez. The show runs till 4:30. We have the room at IHOP from 5 to 7. Any atheist or atheist-friendly person is welcome to join us for that as well. We have a happy hour every Thursday at the Dog and Duck Pub. You just saw the graphic for that a minute ago. That's at the corner of 17th and Guadalupe. That begins around 7 o'clock. Anybody who's 21 or over and wants to come down and join us can do that. We have a rotating series of Wednesday night. I believe this Wednesday night's gaming. No? This weekend is not a Wednesday night event. It's a Friday night movie night for ACA members. But the following weekend we'll be gaming at Thor's Hammer with CFI. That's Wednesday at 7. The Wednesday after that we'll be bowling at Austin at 300, and the Wednesday after that will be billiards at Side Pocket Billiards on Lamar. The lecture series that's coming up, we're going to be continuing that. We don't know who the lecturer is going to be for October. That will return to the first Sunday of the month. We'll give you more details when we find out about that. There is one special event coming up towards the end of this month. That's September 22nd, is the Bat Cruise, our second annual Bat Cruise, and we're going to try and make this a recurring thing. For all ACA members, guests, potential members, anybody who wants to find out about that, you can go to the website. There's more information on what it costs to come along with us. And please sign up early so that we know how many people are coming. We can make sure that we've covered the costs and make arrangements if we haven't. It's a really good kind of evening out. We bring along some food, take the boat out, watch the bats come back into the bridge late at night. Last time there was some guitar and music and just general fun and discussion. So we're looking forward to that again this year, and hopefully we can make this a recurring event. Also, if you're an ACA member, the board meeting will be next Sunday, 10 o'clock at Schlotsky's. The Schlotsky's right there on Toomey next to Romeo's, instead of the regular location. That'll happen before the lecture. I know the website has a different information on it. Don's going to change that later. And all of the ACA members are welcome to come to the board meeting as well and interact with us and voice your opinion on the decisions we're getting ready to make, which may include some building committee decisions. And I wanted to make sure everybody knew about that, especially with the Bat Cruise coming up. It's a good chance to go ahead and register for the Bat Cruise as well. So I think that takes care of all the announcements, and I'll turn it over to Tracie. How you doing?
Good.
Welcome again for your monthly visit.
Okay.
Where you get to educate everybody.
All right, we'll see.
What are we talking about?
We got some viewer mail. Was a person named Jared wrote in and said, have you ever done or are you planning to do any shows about religious atheists? I happen to be an atheist and also a devout Taoist, so that would be an interesting show for me. You mentioned Buddhism and atheism not being exclusive terms, but from the conversations I have had with people of faith, they don't really seem to understand how that can even happen.
Right.
And I had a little bit of discussion with Jared about how he's defining religion.
It's interesting also that little problem with people of faith not understanding it doesn't just apply to something like Buddhism, which is primarily secular in nature, but also we've had the same conversation with regard to Judaism, where somebody is Jewish by heritage and may Russell, one of our co-hosts, is Jewish by heritage, but is an atheist.
Right.
And a lot of people of faith don't actually understand that that's not any kind of contradiction. They're so tied to this must be a religious thing that they don't quite grasp the heritage part of it.
Right, yeah.
And I had problems with it as well early on. It's something that doesn't make sense with the way a lot of us were raised in looking at religion.
Correct, and I think that has a lot to do, we're going to talk a little bit about Taoism today, and how we're raised and how we're taught to view things has a lot to do with, I think, why there might be some misunderstandings or why there might be some ambiguity with regard to interpreting books like the Tao Te Ching. I got another, the TV list got another letter from someone named Brandon, and that was a little bit after Jared wrote, like about a week after Jared wrote, and he had a topic going on that was similar to the idea of where do atheists find meaning. And Brandon himself is an atheist, and he has meaning, but he was having a discussion with someone about having children, and what was the point to having children, or what would be the meaning to children if you just believe in death and that's it. But I mean, there's a lot of people that believe in death and that's it, and they have kids. So we had a little bit of discussion about that, and I told him that someone else, was talking about the basis for meaning in atheism. Right. And he was, and Brandon wrote in and said, does this mean you guys might one day have a show on meaning and purpose for atheists, since it comes up so often from callers on the show? Well, today I'm not really going to take on that broad a topic of finding meaning, because the fact is, atheism itself does not provide a meaning in life. But once you establish that you are an atheist, there are many philosophies to choose from as far as how you want to view the world or how you do view the world. And generally, I'm going to say that in general, you're going to, even if you aren't exposed to other philosophies, whatever you're going to come up with in regard to how you view the world is either going to be in line with an existent philosophy, or it's going to be in line with maybe a couple of philosophies put together. Yeah. But I think a person would be very hard-pressed to individually come up with something on their own and then find that, wow, this is a whole new way of looking at the world. I'm not going to say you couldn't, but it'd be pretty tough.
Right, and when we're talking about that, we're not necessarily referring to religious philosophies at all.
Correct.
I mean, for example, the number of labels that you could apply to me as an atheist, a secular humanist, a realist, a naturalist, a materialist, all those things that take bits and pieces or different philosophies on the whole and put them together to kind of describe how I view the world.
Right. And I think what, I want to say at first that there are some people who would not consider things like Buddhism or things like Taoism to be a religion. There are some people who look at that and they say it's a philosophy. But it just depends on what you label religion, because that's very vague and broad. There's some people who say that anything you do with regularity that has to do with ritual or rites is religion, whether it involves gods or not.
Or Sunday football.
Okay, there you go. You watch it religiously.
If you have that broad
right.
of a definition of religion, then some things like that would apply.
Or politics might be someone's religion. He's very into the Republican Party. So, I mean, it just depends on what you're going to define as religion. I think the way that Jared, if I understand him correctly, was using it was simply that most people would, when you look up Taoism, it is defined generally as a religion.
Right.
And he's saying, in that regard, I am a religious atheist.
When I went to the Hate Free at UT week, and they had representatives of a number of different religions, the representative for Buddhism made the point of saying that, from his perspective, Buddhism isn't a religion, and it's also not a philosophy. It's something completely different, which is fine. He can
right.
define that however he wants. Some of this kind of, though, comes down to this confusion over the term of spiritual. A lot of people, when they get away from religion, or if they're put off by a different specific religion, they'll start saying, well, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual.
Right.
And what that means may vary widely between different people. And
Sure.
it comes into a lot of this. Things aren't so neatly, they don't neatly fit into buckets as much as we'd like them to.
And there are some people who label spiritual simply as having sort of an aesthetic sense of belonging, and it has nothing to do with the idea of soul to them. And then other people consider spiritual to have supernatural beliefs So, yeah, these things don't have, yes, you can look them up and they have definitions, but in common usage they have varying definitions, because there's really no way to pin down what someone means when they say they feel like they're a spiritual person. I wanted to hit off with Taoism to explain that there's a few concepts. We're not completely unfamiliar with them in Western thought, but we tend to either not look at them with as much emphasis, or maybe look at them a little differently than they're viewed in the East. And it's not that there's no conflict, it just has to do with emphasis. So the first thing I wanted to do, because we always joke about the wristwatch analogy in Christianity, so I'm going to use my wristwatch as the analogy. In the East, Taoism is basically Chinese, but it's the same in Japan as well. You have this idea that the universe, they have two words for universe in Japan. One is the universe as a whole, and the other word for universe means the universe with its component parts, or it's usually, I think it's literally expressed, or at least this is what I've heard. I don't speak Japanese, but Joseph Campbell said that it is literally translated the universe of 10,000 things. So 10,000 is just sort of their number for everything. So you've got the universe of the things and the universe that is the cohesive unit. And that's how what Taoism kind of focuses on. They say that there is like a cohesive view, that you can say that there is the cohesive universe that encompasses sort of the natural laws and the physical laws that just sort of apply. And it's all sort of bound together with these laws that they, of course, back then they didn't have the understanding of physics that we have, but you can still observe the principles of physics in how things work. So they understood that there was cohesive energy, and I don't want to say energy in a mystic sense, although there are some people that interpret it that way when they read about it, and they say that this is a mystic energy, and those would be religious Taoists. But if you look at it as just sort of a principle of unity, in the way that we would say that everything adheres to physical law, then you could be a secular Taoist and say that that principle of unity is not anything mystic. It's not got anything to do with a spiritual energy or anything like that. It's just simply an observation that you've got the unit and then it's got parts. And my watch has parts. It's got 3 hands. It's got a winding mechanism. It's got a band, and then the band has little links in it, and then the band has a snap in it. So you can keep breaking this down. Part of this is silver, part of it is gold, and I can sit here and define this thing all day long by component parts. We could open it up, we could look at gears, and you can get smaller and smaller into what is in this watch, or you can just say it's a watch. And
in Philly, it's worth $50.
if that, I don't know. But the other thing that I want to use my watch for is it has ticks. I don't have numbers on my watch. I just have these little
Right.
gold ticks that go around the side, and those represent numbers. And we understand that the big one on top is 12, and then it kind of goes around. Well, according to, and this is in Taoism, but it's also, again, just an Eastern emphasis, they would look at this and say that the space between those ticks where there is no ticks makes the ticks useful. So in other words, if we didn't have the non-tick space, the ticks would have no meaning.
Sure.
All right, that is the concept of non-being and the importance of non-being. So when you hear non-being, yes, they do apply it in a larger sense to existing and not existing, but they also apply it in a general sense to something is this or something is not this, and the thing that it's not is as useful as the thing that it is. And we're going to talk about that in a little more detail, but I wanted to give the watch tick as an example just to give a general overall view. When we hit this, remember the ticks on the watch and the space between the ticks that's not the ticks, because that becomes important. So then we've got an idea of dualism and duality. And there is a misconception a lot of times that duality has to do with opposites, that you have black and white and good and evil. Now, some things are a duality that has to do with opposites. Like you can have the concept of good is not an existent thing, like a mug. It's just how you view what is right behavior, let's say. And it's just a concept. And then you have, when you think of the concept of what is good behavior, you automatically have a concept that there's something that is not good behavior. You may or may not define what that is, but if I say something is good, then I must have a concept of something that would not be good. So they look at that as duality. And the reason I want to say don't think of it in terms of opposites is because, for example, to the Taoist, everything is an example of duality. So that mug or my watch it has a duality to it. But there is no negative watch, like good versus evil. What they would say is there's the watch, and then there's everything that's not the watch. So you've got watch and not watch. And how I defined that in my notes was it's the difference between X and negative X versus X and non-X. So it's not necessarily negative X, it's just what is not X. And I think if we can just keep those concepts in mind and keep them straight, the rest of this will make a lot more sense and not tend to be distorted by too much of a Western emphasis, which it really wasn't written to represent. I went to BeliefNet and just pulled down a general explanation of Taoism, because I could sit up here and I can say how I interpret it or what I think about it, but the reality is I would rather go ahead and just give a general sort of definitional explanation of it that's not colored by my personal opinion of it.
Sure.
I'm going to insert my thoughts on it and say, here's how I take this. But I'm going to say that and I give quote examples from the Tao Te Ching. And the Tao Te Ching is a book that was written probably 2,500 years ago or so. And the title, Tao, let's just say Tao, first of all, means the way. Now, here in the US, we're familiar with the idea of the way as it relates to Christianity. People sometimes use that phrase.
Right.
This is not that phrase. What they mean by the way is simply the way something is. And we're going to give an example later of a reed. Reeds are flexible. Like when you see a reed in a riverbed, it'll flex. It's very floppy. Well, they would say that the way of the reed is to flex. So it doesn't have any kind of, now there are religious Taoists that are going to give it, say that yes, this has like a meaning of something more spiritual to the reed. But frankly, I think it's just the text itself doesn't really clearly state that. It simply gives like some very poetic thoughts. And even in the writing, there's a supposed author, his name was Lao Tzu, but that literally translates to old man. So the chances that that's somebody's real name are pretty slim. Chances are there was no real author to this, or either it was a compilation or else the author is unknown. But I want to stress that to the Taoist, that is relatively, not just relatively unimportant, it's completely unimportant. It doesn't matter who wrote it. It's not like the Bible where you have this idea that it had to be people inspired by God. Nobody is saying that Lao Tzu was inspired by God. They're simply saying that he wrote some very important things to some people and that they really take it to be great wisdom, the people that accept it. So we're going to look at a little bit of quotes from the book, some general descriptions at BeliefNet, and then some ideas that I had when I read the Tao Te Ching and how I took it. The title, I forgot to get back to that. Ching just means book. So the title of the book really just means the application, the book that applies the way, or how to apply the way. So it's about 2,500 years ago this was written. And they look at words as like reality as a finger pointing at the moon is the example that BeliefNet gives. And they explain that as Taoism states that words are just a sign to point to the non-conceptual ultimate reality. It is of value to not obsess over the conceptual pointer, but to see the ultimate reality clearly. So it sounds almost stupid to say that words are not the thing itself. And yet sometimes people get bogged in words, or they get bogged, I should say, not so much in words as labels.
Yeah.
And the quote that I pulled from the Tao Te Ching that I want to apply to that idea is one that says, "The way that can be told of is not an unvarying way. The names that can be named are not unvarying names. It was from the nameless that heaven and earth sprang. The named is but the mother that rears the 10,000 creatures, each after its kind." Let me say that if that passage sounded like crazy nonsense to you, you will not do well to read the Tao Te Ching, because this is how the entire book reads. So you have to really have a grasp. I mean, I do understand that I'm reading just this one passage, but that's what the book sounds like.
Sure.
This is not, that one line, "It was from the nameless that heaven and earth sprang." If you read that to most Christians, they would interpret the nameless to be their God. That is not what this passage means. What this passage is saying is that heaven and earth, it doesn't mean literally the sky and the planet. It's talking about nature.
Right.
Nature is, according to them, there's like the principle that runs through nature, or what I as a secularist consider to be the laws of physics, is not to them a nameless thing. They're observing something that made this thing cohesive, that they were saying, I don't know what it is and I can't quite put my finger on it, but there's something running through this that makes this thing have unity. And when they were observing that, they understood, I don't know what to call it. I'm going to call it the way of nature, or the way of the world, or the way of the universe, or the way of this thing itself. But I don't really know what else to say about it beyond that. And when they say the named is but the mother that rears the 10,000 creatures, think back to when we just talked about the universe of 10,000 things. That number represents everything. It doesn't mean literally 10,000. So when you start to name, like we do with science, science is an examination of differentiating and breaking down components. You look at something and you start taking it apart. Science takes things apart and says, what is this? What is this? And what is that? And then, what happens when you take this part out? And if you're going to study things in a scientific way, you have to label, you have to break it down, and you have to examine the component parts, and you have to be able to say, why is this different than this, even though it's the same thing? It's all part of a pen, but you've got this other part here that's not this part. And so you start looking at the differences and perceiving the differences. And we are very good in the West at perceiving the differences. And Taoism doesn't say that's wrong. It simply says, understand that you still have a pen.
Right.
So
it kind of ties into this idea of what is nameless, ties into what we were talking about earlier about people who would identify themselves as spiritual. Not all of them, but some of them, who would say, I just don't know what it is. It seems that there's some kind of, whether it be interconnectedness or unity or governing principle, or among some quantum theorists, the grand unifying theory could actually turn into their spiritual quest. And it's because it's something that you're unable to properly conceive may or may not exist. I mean, it may be a fiction that you're inventing in your own head to describe things that you don't understand. But because you can't conceive it, it is impossible to really describe attributes of it.
Right.
So that's why in Taoism it needs to be the nameless.
Right.
Because the things we can put names to are the things that we can select component attributes of and apply names to and labels to those.
And if you go online and you do a search for what is the Tao, oh, good luck. Like, you'll never find an explanation. And there's not one in the Tao Te Ching. There is no definition for the Tao, because the opinion of Lao Tzu was that you could not define this thing. It's undefinable in the sense that I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is. I'm looking at something, I don't know what it is. And all he could do was describe things where he saw it apply. And he would say, I see it in this, but I still don't know really what I'm looking at. And in that the vagueness that he used, I think, is what makes this such a personal religion, because it's not a book of doctrines, and it's not a book of rules, and it's not a book of really even teachings. It's just a book of examples of what Lao Tzu was describing as what he thought represented the Tao, but he didn't know, he couldn't ever really say what it was. He couldn't say, here's the Tao. Sure. He never was able to do that in the book, and he actually said that would be a stupid thing to try to do, in his opinion. So he left it very open. So a lot of people, when they read the book, say, here's what I see. And I'm sure I do that too. I may be completely off from what he was trying to express, but when I read it, this is what I apply it to. And anyone can do that, which I think is what makes the belief system such a flexible belief system that can be applied so generally to so many different types of people, whether they believe in supernatural things or not. So it's just sort of don't miss the forest for the trees. It has to do, when you hear the named and the nameless, he's saying the 10,000 things is the trees, and then you've got the larger nameless forest, and don't forget that you're in a forest no matter how much you're looking at a tree. So let's see, back to the belief net description. Chinese beliefs, religious beliefs and practices overlap. So the exact number of Taoists is difficult to estimate. However, about 225 million people adhere to Chinese traditional religions, of which Taoism is probably the chief one. They talk a little bit about Lao Tzu, who they believe, if he did live and write the book, it would have been around 551 to 470 BCE. And again, I just want to point out that it really isn't relevant. This book could be completely authorless, and there could be no tradition surrounding who wrote it, and it wouldn't make a bit of difference to a Taoist. It has no impact whatsoever on their belief. The main tenets, this is where it gets a little difficult, because there really aren't many tenets to it. Taoism takes its name from the word Tao, the way, the ancient Chinese name for the ordering principle that makes cosmic harmony possible. Not a transcendent ultimate, the Tao is found in the world, especially in nature. It is the ultimate reality, as well as the proper natural way of life humans must follow. Now, I'm going to put a little asterisk there, because I'm going to say that Taoism doesn't tell you what you need to do to follow the natural way of life. It simply says, be true to your nature, and be true to nature, and go with this principle.
Well, I'm wondering if that isn't more of a statement of, when it says, when you're talking about the proper natural way that humans must follow, it's not a dictum of do this, but
Right.
It is saying that this is what you're going to do. I don't know if there's any kind of inevitableness or fatalism.
Death is
in it.
inevitable, yeah.
Well, I'm talking about fatalism on the whole, whereas you're going to do whatever you're going to do, and perhaps it's already preordained or dictated.
No, there's nothing like that. In fact, Taoism is very, very upfront about the idea that you have a choice to act or to not act. But it does say that you need to follow your nature, just like the reed has to flex. That's how they would express it. But they don't tell you what your nature is. And I think part of that is understanding that different environments and different situations and different people are going to have different things that to them are what is the right thing to do, or the natural thing to do, whatever you want to label it, the thing that makes them most comfortable or that fits best with them. So he's not telling anybody you need to flex. He's saying you need to follow whatever you consider to be what is natural to you. Don't do something that isn't comfortable for you, that isn't what you think is what you should be doing. And let's see, Taoism prizes naturalness, inaction, and inwardness. And with inaction, we talked a little bit about this before the program, but I need to mention it. The inaction is sort of like the non-being issue. We talked about Matt plays cards. Well, when you have a poker game, you can have many hands, like mini games within the whole game. So you could play poker for several hours and have a lot of different poker hands within that game. And in some of those hands, you may make the choice to not play. You can fold your cards and say, I'm not playing this hand. Well, Taoism is saying, when you don't play the hand, it's not that you're not doing anything, because actually folding is part of your strategy. It's something that you are doing, that you are making a choice to do. And there is an impact and a result to folding, just like there's an impact and a result to saying, give me 3 new cards. It's the same to Lao Tzu, to say, you act or you don't act, you're still responsible for what occurs because of that inaction or because of that action. But what he does stress is that it's extremely important to understand when inaction is necessary. So he would be very into the idea, or the book is very into the idea of, know that there is many, many times when inaction is really the way to go, and to not do anything is the best thing. So we tend to not really think about inaction too much, or at least not in the same terms as we think of action. And you mentioned that, like the idea of some people feeling like I'm not responsible if I don't do something.
Right.
And we talked in the consciousness program about how the brain is, it's possible that the brain is kicking out an impulse, and that you make a conscious action to negate that impulse and to say, I'm not going to act on that, and that you're not really producing a thought as much as canceling a thought. And it's that same idea of saying that not, toggling it, letting it go, letting the action go forward, by saying I'm going to do this, is really no different than stopping the action and saying I'm not going to do this. You're still making a decision there to act or to not act, and there's repercussions either way. Let's see.
Just as a quick reminder, if you're watching the show live, the telephone number is actually up over in that corner. We will be going to calls in a little while. Tracie's got some more stuff to get through. If you're a Taoist or have feedback or input on this, please feel free to call in with any corrections or insight or expansion of ideas. And if you're not, if there's some other subject that you wanted to talk about, whether you're a believer or a non-believer, please feel free to call in on that as well. And anybody who doesn't get through on the telephone line or doesn't want to can email tv@atheist-community.org. And that email goes to most of the people involved with the show. And there are also, as a reminder, a number of Yahoo Messenger lists that are available. You can go to the website and find those and ask questions and interact with people as well. So.
Okay. Taoism prizes naturalness, inaction, and inwardness. And I wanted to point out, this goes back to the song that I started with, which was The Power of Goodbye by Madonna. And one of the reasons I picked that is because it's a good illustration, I think, of the concept of how we look at action differently than non-action. The song itself is about a relationship, but it could just as easily be about any situation where you really want something to occur. And I think everyone can relate to a situation. Relationship is a good one. A lot of people have that experience, but it doesn't have to be. But if you think about the example of a romantic relationship where you're just killing yourself to make it work, and it's not working, but you just keep trying and you keep working and you keep, struggling to keep it together and make it happy, and it's just not coming to be that way. Well, what the song is about is that at a certain point, sometimes the right thing to do is to stop trying and to say, I really need to cut my losses and run. I need to say goodbye. I need that. And she's saying in the song that there's no greater power than the power of goodbye, or how the Tao would call it is the power of letting go or inaction. And to stop acting sometimes is the right thing to do. It's the best thing to do. And we have a tendency, if I were to say fill in the blank, there's no greater power than the power of, what would anybody say generally in the United States? What would be your thought as far as a general fill in the blank there?
Oh, I think love is the one that everybody's going to toss in there.
Yeah, no doubt. We would say love. And that would tend to be more of an argument for trying to keep the relationship going.
And I don't want to downplay love, but I think my answer would probably be reason.
Yeah.
But
But the idea of, acting on love, we think love motivates you to act.
Sure.
What she's saying is the power of letting go motivates you to free yourself. It allows you to stop wasting energy and resources on a thing that is not working out for you, that is not in your best interest, and it's just never going to work. And so the wisdom to release a thing and to let your energy be free from this and to not let it be a drain on you is not everyone is wise enough to do that. And I think each one of us, it's the rare person at least, that has never been in a situation where they have unwisely put in too much resources or too much time or energy into a situation that was just doomed.
Right.
And that they would have seen it if they would have just stopped and thought and said, is this really worth what I'm trying to accomplish here? Or is this really necessary?
Well, it's the only thing, the inaction or stopping a repetitive action is the only thing that allows you to make any actual progress. If you're spinning your wheels, the first thing you need to do is take your foot off the accelerator, get out, and maybe stick a board under the wheel or do something that's productive.
Right.
So that, the inaction in that aspect, I do agree that it is incredibly powerful and kind of freeing to be able to do that.
Well, I just wanted to, the reason I'm stressing that is because within the Tao Te Ching, there's a lot of passages that advocate inaction. And I wouldn't want someone to read that and to say, this book is just about sitting on your butt doing nothing. Like, why is that so great? But it's not really, that's not the point that it's making. It's saying that it takes a wise person to know when to proceed and when to just say, you know what, this is not worth proceeding over. Back to the belief net, generally speaking, there are two kinds of Taoism, philosophical and religious. Philosophical Taoism is rational, contemplative, and non-sectarian, and accepts death as a natural returning to the Tao. And again, it's not returning to God or returning to some spiritual, bank. It's just about the cycle of life, that things live, things die, and then things rise to life from that. You've got plants that die and then that fertilizes the next crop and, whatever. It's just about things return, things are cyclical, and it's very into cyclical. The idea of returning comes up often in the book, and it's just a cyclical returning. Let's see, a quote example of inaction from the Tao Te Ching says, "So a wise leader may say, I practice inaction and the people look after themselves. But from the sage, it is so hard at any price to get a single word, that when his task is accomplished, his work is done. Throughout the country, everyone says it happened of its own accord." And that's what I wrote about that. My own thought was, here's an example of how Lao Tzu expressed harmony and how a follower of the Tao would manifest harmony. It's the idea that my actions and inactions are so balanced and so in sync with the material reality that what I do is indiscernible from things taking their own course without my action. One way to describe this in Western thought would be to point out, and this is where I thought a good example was green building. We have green architecture, where we'll put up a building and we'll put it into an environment where we try to not upset the environment. We don't just go tear it down and put up some McMansion or put in a huge subdivision. Sometimes you'll see somebody that builds a house that's very energy efficient, that is structurally constructed so that it blends in with the mountain landscape, or and it makes great use of the nature around it, so that when you look at it, you say, wow, that, what I think I said is efficiency and seamlessness. It's that idea of it's just so efficient, so seamless that it's just almost part of the landscape when you're done with it. That's what he's trying to express, the idea of just being so balanced and so in tune with what's going on that you affect it, and you're so good at affecting it and yet keeping it going and not imposing on it, that you just let it flow and you're able to affect the course, and still it's almost indiscernible from the thing doing itself. Incarnations, according to BeliefNet, Taoism does not refer to any specific incarnation of God, and I would agree with that. It never addresses the way of being anything to do with a God. The origin of the universe.
As a matter of fact, the idea that in whatever sense that a God God concept might filter its way in, as with the nameless that we talked about earlier, it is the actual concept in Taoism is completely non-consistent with the idea of a God, because a God, the concept necessarily requires that you be able to describe it in its attributes in some sense. You may not think you have a good grasp on it, but God itself carries a definitional weight with it.
Well, sure, you're pointing to something. It's like that finger
but
pointing
you're
at
also,
the moon.
whatever this cohesive element is, if it even exists, by applying the God label to it, you've now, at a minimum, applied another label of intelligence or personage, that this is not just a natural law or whatever, that it has some kind of intelligence.
Yeah, now see, Wayne Dyer, he was giving his lecture, and he's got a lecture going on about Taoism right now. And he is a theist, so he looks at this from a theistic perspective, and he sees theism in it. I'm not going to say that a person couldn't apply some concept of God to it, or say that whatever this principle is, I'm going to label this God. Or maybe, like for example, a Christian might have the idea that they're talking about my God, but they just didn't know what it was.
Right.
Like in China, they just didn't know, but they were seeing my God. Well,
in all those cases, though, they're adding.
Right, but to a Christian, it would be okay to do that because they would be seeing their belief system as superior to this one.
Sure.
So they would say that the Taoist belief that they don't know what it is. Well, I mean, but they would say that because Lao Tzu said, "I don't know what this is," it was just his ignorance about God that led to that statement. So it could be compatible with a Christian view if you took a pretty egocentric view of it, which wouldn't be strange. That would be a pretty common thing.
That's the most diplomatic way of putting it I've ever heard. It wouldn't be strange for Christians to look down on other religions.
Okay, so anyway, all matter is a manifestation of the ultimate reality, and generally Taoist beliefs don't find modern scientific discoveries contradictory to Taoist thought. And my input on that was that this is probably because the Taoists rely mainly on expressing observations about nature and reality. They actually avoid explanations of natural mechanics. They might talk about how a reed is flexible and how that benefits the reed in observable reality, but they don't generally make claims about what makes the reed flexible. They would simply say it's the nature of the reed to flex. It's the Tao, or the way, of the reed to be flexible. So I think that's pretty clear. Death in Taoism, all it said at BeliefNet was death has no particular meaning to Taoists, and it doesn't. It's pretty much a non-issue. It's just simply the time when you are going to not be anymore. It's
when you finally become capable of inaction on a permanent basis.
Yeah, it's the ultimate inaction. And non-being, and it's everything. Evil is, that's not really, I mean, if you could read probably the entire Tao Te Ching, and you're not going to get a good grasp on any thought of evil. What they said at BeliefNet was, to understand the Taoist notion of good and evil, it's important to distinguish between the concept of evil versus the reality of evil. So I would agree that if you're talking about concepts, the Taoist philosophy does deal with concepts in a general way, but it's not going to deal with like an action as being evil. It's simply going to sway you away from doing things that you're not suited to do or not comfortable doing. It's not going to tell you that it's evil to do that. So as a concept, Taoists do not hold the position of good against evil. Rather, they see interdependence of all dualities. So one labels something as good, and one automatically creates evil. And they're talking in conceptual terms. When you label something good, you automatically then understand that there's something that's not good. Otherwise, what does it mean to call something good? That is, all concepts necessarily are based on one aspect versus another. And I would say, think of that again in terms of the non. So you've got the good and the non. It might even be more helpful to say, rather than good and evil, to think of it in terms of good and not good. If a concept were to have only one aspect, it would be nonsensical, which you can't. Like I say, if I'm going to say something is good, I mean something. So there's got to be something that I don't think is good for good to have any meaning, and that's all this is saying. The quote example that I gave was, in Tao, the only motion is returning, the only useful quality, weakness. For though all creatures under heaven are the products of being, being itself is the product of non-being. My statement on that was, here we have a statement reflecting that being is caused by non-being. Not in the sense we would normally understand it, however. This isn't a statement of universal origins. It's a statement regarding duality, in the same way good creates evil or evil creates good. The moment you acknowledge one, you have automatically acknowledged the other. One cannot exist as a concept without the other. In the same way, weakness would necessitate strength, and weakness would also represent a giving in to one's nature and natural flow. Again, it's like the flexibility of the reed going with the wind and not breaking by fighting it. And there's actually a story, and I can't remember if this was out of some of my Buddhist reading, but I remembered this story when I was thinking of this. There's a story about a big windstorm, and it comes from an Eastern view. Big windstorm, and there's a giant tree, a really big strong tree, and then there's the small reed by the river, and the windstorm comes one night, and the tree has been there for 100 years, and it knocks that tree right down, roots and all, just uproots the whole thing. And in the morning, the tree is laying there dying, and the reed is, bent over, but it's starting to come back up. And the moral to the story is about, even though you've got this very strong thing, because the strength of the tree lies in its ability to resist instead of to flex, it was the tree's downfall. Because when you hit, if you only view the world in your imposition and in your rigidness and your ability to go against, then what happens when you come up against something stronger than you is that you're destroyed. So you have to think in terms of, when something comes up to me that's stronger than I am, I might want to consider being flexible instead of trying to fight against a thing that could potentially destroy me.
Of course, there's also the possibility that you could have some reed harvester walking along, plucking reeds up.
Well,
and
yeah.
that tree gets to survive because it can't be plucked up.
But his whole point was to try to open the mind, I think, to the idea of when to not act. This section of belief.net, I'm going to take a little bit of issue with it. It says the reality of good and evil is that all actions contain some aspect of each. This is represented in the Tai Chi, more commonly referred to as the yin-yang symbol. Any action would have some negative yin and some positive yang aspect to it. Taoists believe that nature is a continual balance between yin and yang, and that any attempt to go toward one extreme or the other will be ineffective, self-defeating, and short-lived. When people interfere with the natural balance by trying to impose their egoistic plans, they will not succeed. Rather, the non-egoistic person allows nature to unfold, watching it ebb and flow from good to bad and back again. I don't take as much issue with the second part of that paragraph as I do with the top. I almost wonder if, when they're describing the Tai Chi and the yin and yang concepts and the reality of evil, if they're not looking at it from a more religious Taoist way, because the article is discussing both. I'd be open to hearing a secular Taoist give me an example of what they mean by the reality of evil, but as far as I know, I don't believe that there's a real evil in Taoism. But like I say, I'd be open-minded, and maybe from a religious aspect, the more religious or more spiritual Taoist might lean more toward this than a secular Taoist, but I can't speak for them. I can just say this is how I view it. My quote example was, "We turn clay to make a vessel, but it is on the space where there is nothing that the usefulness of the vessel depends." This is just like the watch tick analogy we used earlier. When you have a vessel, like this mug, you make the mug, but really the mug is useless if you don't have an empty space in the middle that holds the water. So it's the part of the mug that's not the mug that makes the mug useful. That's all.
And the handle.
Yeah, the handle.
The handle's got a hole that makes it useful.
If it didn't have the hole, it'd be very difficult. So yeah, you have to. But the idea
Aren't
of
these handsome ACA mugs? We use them for all kinds of analogies.
But anyway, that's the idea. What all Lao Tzu is saying when he talks about that is the idea of, when you see this mug, you should think of, or try to think of, or open your mind at least to the idea that perhaps this space is as much a part of the mug as the mug, because the mug's functionality relies on that.
Look, they got a big close-up.
That's right. That's right. That was my example. So I'm not going to read my response, because pretty much that's what it was. It doesn't negate any kind of Western idea. It just simply is a different way of looking at it that we don't normally look at. BeliefNet goes on to say, another way of understanding this is that the sage person understands the reality of good and evil, whereas the fool concentrates on the concept of good and evil. The sage knows that any evil will soon be replaced by good. The fool is forever fruitlessly trying to eliminate evil. And I took a little issue with this as well, because this almost to me did sound like they were describing it as saying that you should not take action against what you perceive as evil.
Right.
And I do not interpret Taoism to be saying that. However, somebody might disagree with me. Like I say,
Well,
it's fairly vague.
Whether or not Taoism actually says it, I actually disagree with it as
I
a
would
principle.
too, yeah.
And so if that is in fact, kind of what they're advocating, if a Taoist is advocating that sort of inaction, then we've found one major spot of
Right.
disagreement.
Yeah, I would agree with
'Cause
that.
I would say that and I have a different concept about the reality of good and evil. And while I recognize that an individual action can have consequences, in which you could probably make some argument that there may be some good and
Right.
evil in anything, I don't think that there's this inherent balance. I don't buy into any kind of idea of a cosmic
Right.
scale, karma as a balancing factor as it comes into other religions. I don't think Taoism actually includes that specifically.
No, it doesn't.
But this idea of good and evil, just because some actions may have different consequences, and you could do something good like end hunger worldwide.
Or oppose Hitler.
Yeah. But that good action of ending hunger may have some bad consequences that you didn't foresee. But my perspective is that you can actually, while you may not be able to specifically quantify everything, you can kind of make an assessment about how good something is and how evil something is.
At least a personal assessment,
Sure.
if nothing else, yeah.
And if you aren't interested in resisting evil because of some claim of futility, or
Or that it's just going to take care of itself. I don't believe that.
Yeah, that it's going to take care of itself. Then you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
I mean, when we take a good assessment of Taoism and consider it, there are many things that I find very positive about it. And if I were to put up a list of religions, world religions, and say, this is the order in which I think they are most evil, most harmful, you'd have like Islam at the top, followed by Christianity, and then somewhere way down at the bottom, you'd probably have things like Taoism. And the reason for that is within Taoism, it's a personal religion. It's even when it's done religiously and not just philosophically. There's no proselytizing. There's no movement to impose Taoist beliefs on others. There's no movement to legislate. If there's nobody who's going to say,
Right.
this needs to be a Taoist nation.
Well, in fact, imposing it on other people would be anti-Taoist.
Right.
Yeah.
But there are drawbacks, and there are things that I would disagree with, and one of them is this idea that you shouldn't resist evil. And oddly enough, for you people out there who are saying, who may also be Christians, you might want to read your Bible, because Jesus also said, resist not evil. So I have a fundamental problem with both of them, because I think the best thing we can do is to resist evil. And unfortunately, one of the reasons why I think the religious people don't quite get that is because, well, they're following something that's inherently evil. In some cases, the types of things that religion pushes, the way it poisons a particular mind, the way it gets people to accept things that aren't true, that is something that I'd qualify as evil. And when you've got a philosophical position, and I'm going to do a little minor rant that we can come back from, but consider, like, for example, within Christianity, and one of the reasons why I'm sure somebody went, oh, how could he put Christianity so high? Well, I'll tell you, one of the reasons is that there's only, within Christianity, within Orthodox Christianity anyway, there's only one unforgivable sin, and that's apostasy. Or, depending on how you want to interpret it, it could be blaspheming of the Holy Spirit, which may be one of two different things. It may either be attributing the works of the Holy Spirit to some other agent, or it may be denial of the existence of the Holy Spirit. Any of those situations all come down to thought crime. The key element is what you believe, what you profess to believe. This is, by the doctrine, the single worst possible sin or evil that anybody could do, is simply to deny the existence of this God or misunderstand the existence of this being. Christianity portrays this as the one unforgivable sin, which to me tells me that even though most of you are going to go, no, it doesn't mean that. Yes, it does. That this is the prime evil, disbelief, apostasy. Nothing could possibly be worse. And if you don't think so, then think about the types of things that were advocated and ordered by the God you believe in the Old Testament. run around, Deuteronomy, I think it's 2010 or so, where basically they're giving the marching orders for every time you go to war. Oh, when you go to war, make sure you put your house in order, have the priests out front, have them say this. Don't fear anything, you're all going out to do God's work and it's all going to work out. Then you march your army out to whoever you're going to go up to war against, and the first thing you do is you make them an offering of peace. Only the Bible has this really perverted view of what peace actually is, because in this situation, peace means they surrender and become your slaves and you own all their stuff. That's peace, according to this passage. And if you don't believe me, look it up. I don't need to read you the Bible. You probably got your own. But if they don't agree to your peace, then you're supposed to destroy them and not leave a single breathing thing in their village or city or whatever it is that you think you're going to go and conquer in the name of Yahweh. And examples of this occur specifically with the Midianites, where they go and they slaughter everybody. And some people, some of these nice Israelites had a little bit of compassion and said, well, let's not kill all the women and children. We'll bring them back with us. And they get back. Moses throws a hissy fit, said, what the hell are you guys doing? Well, I said, kill everything. So now I want you to go kill every boy child, every woman that's not a virgin. But we'll keep those nice little young virgins and divide them up amongst ourselves. That, to me, is nothing that any good being or person, any person with any sense of morality, could advocate. That is far more evil than disbelief. And yet the tenets and doctrine of your orthodox views have that inverted. And that, in my opinion, is true evil. To spin somebody's mind so that they look at two situations where one is obviously more evil and they choose the other as more evil. That is evil. Your brain has been polluted by this mind virus that is affecting your ability to discern reality and to have good moral judgment. Walking lockstep with the dogma. We've talked about the people who, and I don't want to get off on an abortion thing, but who would go to these anti-abortion rallies, and when asked, what do you think should happen to the woman, or do you think abortion is a crime? Oh yeah, it's murder, it's killing. It's a sin, it's murder. And then when asked, well, what do you think should happen to a woman if she has an illegal abortion? Well, they hem and haw. Why? Because down deep, they know that this is different. And I think somewhere down deep, they know that the situation where apostasy is the one unforgivable crime, but slaughtering the innocents and making blood sacrifices and human sacrifices, all of these things ordained and approved or sanctioned by their deity, the idea that these could somehow be less moral is a perversion. And that's why, when we're talking about atheistic religions with Taoism, I find plenty of things that I can object to. But there's a reason why this is the first time we've ever bothered to do a show discussing Taoism. Because, we're only here for 90 minutes every week. And I primarily would like to focus on real issues. And the real issues that are affecting us now are what some people, particularly among Christians, are doing to affect the rights of others. You can believe whatever you want, proselytize all you want. But when you start taking actions and encouraging legislation that affects the rights of others, you've become evil. Got no problem at all saying that. However, let's get back to some more Taoism.
Well, that actually, though, has to do with Taoism, because that's one of the things that the book is trying to point out. It's trying to say, before you take action, stop and think. Do I need to impose myself on this? They would say, in most instances, no, you don't. In most instances, your action, your input, your resources are not necessary. Part of this has to do with the time, I think, the book was written. It was a time of war in China. And I think, personally, that what came out of this was somebody saying, not that you should not act against an injustice, but when you're looking around and you're seeing a lot of war that really probably isn't for anything more than land and power, and you're looking at this and you're saying, really, shouldn't we be exhausting the inaction first before we start going to action? Before you start killing people, maybe we need to see what we can do that doesn't need to kill people, and there's some way to resolve these things, and is it really necessary to I'm killing these people and they're killing my people, and it's just, what is the point? And so for me, I tend to look at the concept of inaction in the book as simply saying that, he prefers inaction. There's a strong preference for the inaction in the book. He doesn't necessarily, he does say that they're both important, and I think I said earlier, that they're equally important, but really he does put an emphasis on inaction. And I think that part of that is that he interpreted that a lot of people are quick to act, that we are quick to respond, or that we do want to say something, or we want to respond to this, I'm going to resist that, or I'm going to, and part of his point is, maybe we act a little too much, and it's better in most cases probably not to act, or it's not necessary to act in most cases.
See, I think I'd have a better time with this if what, and he may well, be advocating this, if it wasn't so much an appeal to inaction as it was to making sure that our actions are measured, rational actions, that they're responses that are required in order to achieve the goal.
That's how I interpret it, but I have to be real clear about that. That's how I interpret it. I can't say that, oh yeah, it's very clear in the book. It absolutely states what I'm saying here. It doesn't. It's not clear. But I take it that way, and it might just be a function of me saying it's unreasonable to say that that inaction is always the best course. I don't believe that. And so I might actually be tempering it, and I might be putting a spin on it and be saying, but there are other people that interpret it that way. We're going to look at some different interpretations of people that are Taoists a little bit later.
Sure, but speaking of inaction, for those of you who out there who aren't taking the action of calling, I don't know for sure if the lines are actually working or not, but as a reminder, after the show, which will be over here in about 28 minutes or so, we're heading over to IHOP, which is at the corner of I-35 and Cesar Chavez. Any atheist or atheist-friendly person is welcome to join us. You do not have to be a member to attend, and that pretty much goes for almost every one of our events. We like to have people come down, have discussions. I've had plenty of different theists, different people of different religions come down to our events and want to have discussions, and that's fine. It's actually one of my favorite things to do is to actually have discussions with people whose ideas and beliefs are different from mine. So we do that, and as long as it's a nice, friendly thing that doesn't interrupt anybody's dinner, it's very welcome. So we'll be down there at 5 o'clock, and we've got the room until about 7. So next on your list with Taoism
is salvation. To the Taoists, this is just a non-issue. They don't believe in salvation. They don't believe in damnation. Another part of the inaction is that he doesn't advocate in the book pursuing too much that's like material. So it's sort of a non-materialistic religion in that it really sort of advocates a simple lifestyle. Not having tons of money, tons of
but it's not advocating asceticism.
No, he doesn't say that you have to be poor. He just says that if you're too focused on material stuff, you're missing a lot. You're seeing the forest, and you're seeing the trees and not the forest.
See, and I find that to be, and just me personally speaking again, I find that to be a lot more reasonable. These, for example, you've got, Siddhartha Buddha and others who are advocating an ascetic lifestyle, and even Jesus is saying, sell all your belongings, give the money to the poor, and follow me. I don't have a problem with that. You're free to live that kind of life if you want. But I think part of it is that is moving to an extreme that isn't necessarily furthering any goal.
Right. I think with him, with the book, my interpretation of it is it's simply about just living, like I say, living simply. It's just think in terms of keep that efficiency and seamlessness in mind. If you are cluttering your house full of crap that you're collecting because you're just so attached to everything, then you're probably not getting what the book would say is the point, which would be, not getting too focused on all this weird material stuff. That it's real and it's there, but, it's really doesn't have much meaning. And so if you're putting a lot of meaning into stuff, you would be sort of focusing on things that Taoism would see as not important. It's not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just really, it's only going to be as important as you make it. And so to them it has no, money would have no real inherent value beyond you need it to live. And as long as I've got enough and I'm looking after my financial needs, I'm fine. I don't need to keep amassing more and more wealth just because I want wealth. they would say that if you don't have some sort of practical goal for it, it's what are you doing? It doesn't make sense.
Although, on the one hand, I'm wondering how, like, the pleasure principle ends up entering into this. Because, for example, if you were living your life, and one of the things that you enjoyed was, let's say, collecting things, and it ended up taking a great deal of your time, money, and resources, but it brought you pleasure, and it was part of your life's pursuit. I'm wondering if Taoists would look down on that as an extravagance that would, or if it would just be that is your nature and therefore go for it.
It would have to be personally assessed, would be my interpretation. It would be personally assessed as to what is the person doing, what is their goal with this. And if you say if it just brings them pleasure, but let's say their collection gets stolen, if they say, oh, well, my collection got stolen and I really miss it because I had some great pieces in there that I can't replace, okay. But if they're devastated and everything that they had was wrapped up in that collection, I think most Taoists would say, yeah, I don't know if you were really going with what was like in your nature and what was best for you, because you tended to put way too much emphasis into this thing that was transient, and instead of just enjoying it, you really wrapped something into it that wasn't an inherent part of the teapot collection or whatever.
Maybe I just was that addictive personality and that was my nature.
Yeah.
How can you tell me I'm wrong?
If you're doing something that hurts you, they would say that you're not really getting to the core, and that you're somewhere in more on the surface.
I'm a big fan of people not hurting themselves, and I'm an even bigger fan of people not hurting each other.
Yeah.
I guess if you're going to hurt somebody, make sure it's yourself.
As far as contemporary issues, like things like positions on, and this is again from BeliefNet, this isn't me. Positions on abortion, homosexuality, divorce, nonviolence, social betterment programs are not clearly stated in the text. One might be able to derive a stance on these issues, but any such stance would be attenuated by the recognition that any stance is just a conceptual abstraction that has little usefulness. So it's sort of saying it's up to you. Whatever you feel about homosexuality, however you feel about abortion, but before you act to stop somebody, ask yourself if action is truly justified. So, or if non-action would be, an okay option to use. Okay, and they do state here that protecting nature is favored, though not by laws or injunction. And
yeah, so it's more of a preferred, this is preferable to, but not we're going to mandate that this needs to happen.
If you went out and started damaging nature, I think most Taoists would not consider that to be a good action. These were, I went and pulled comments from people who expressed that they were Taoists, especially I was looking for secular Taoists because that's kind of what we're talking about today. But I wanted to let other people have input to this so that it wasn't just my interpretation. I wanted other people who actually practice this in a secular situation to say, this is how I view it. And this one was posted. It was called Why I Am a Taoist, and it was somebody named Don, and he wrote, in other words, Taoism is not a metaphysical approach to life. There is no body-spirit dualism. Taoism comments on what can be physically observed. It is a practical approach to existence and stops in attempting to explain higher purposes. It deals with the here and now in relationship to our lives. In this blending of opposites, it values differences. Therefore, it is not patriarchal, it is not hierarchical. There is value and dignity in each entity, for each is part of the whole. Each is connected to the other. In knowing this, then, Taoism asks us to be not just respectful of life, but to hold reverence toward it. I would take issue with that. I'm not sure that it does.
I already did.
Yeah, I think that might be an interpretation.
Said it yet.
I would say that this is definitely his view. That was not my view. Again, it is a matter of being purposeful about not controlling, but working with. And that I would agree with. I think that was a pretty good way of putting it. Not controlling, but working with. And I think it does advocate that as the best option. And what I wrote as a little note to that was think things through and don't be overzealous to impose your ego or will. And the way I look at it is the difference between the little phrase, shoot first and ask questions later. And it would be kind of turning that around and saying, ask first, then shoot only if you must. That's kind of how I look at the difference between our, I want to say general Western attitude, because we're not completely void of this concept. We just don't focus on it that much. Whereas he's saying, focus on it this way.
And I think as the world becomes smaller, you get this blending of cultures anyway, so that these ideas
Right.
become even more commonplace, especially in the modern United States, where everybody's into every new age piece of crap, crystal homeopathy nonsense that they can come up with. One of the things about his thing is that he's saying that Taoism is a practical approach to existence and stops in an attempt to explain higher purposes.
Correct.
I'm an advocate of, whatever philosophical belief, whatever religious belief you want to adhere to, if it brings you satisfaction, if you're enjoying it, if you're not hurting anybody else, not only do you have every right to do that and believe those things, but I would encourage you to some extent. But my principal question, my principal concern is truth. And I'm not talking about capital T truth that might get tossed around by religious people, but about what propositions can we assess as being true or more likely true or more probably true? What's plausible and probable rather than just possible or asserted? And one of the things is this idea of an ultimate reality, which seems to kind of be a common thread among a lot of the Eastern religions, that there is some ultimate reality or some ultimate truth, even if they never get anywhere near to defining it. And basically they're saying you are on your own path to discover whatever this ultimate truth is, or whatever this unifying principle is. And my big question is, and I realize that most of these people would just say, well, you have to try this, and you have to do this particular practice or meditation or whatever that particular religion is advocating to get you there. My question is, why is there any assumption that there is some ultimate truth to begin with? That there is, and I'm not just talking about, in a simple sense of, life's just everything we can see. I'm talking about kind of the grander sense of this unifying concept that a lot of the Eastern religions seem to advocate, and I'm wondering what is there that would make that qualify as truth. I'm not really asking you, I'm just pointing out, where I would differ from some of the Eastern religions is that, these may be good things that teach you more about yourself, they may teach you more about reality, but if we're really talking about a system that is a practical approach to existence, I'm wondering why a religion qualifies for that and not just, for example, the scientific method seems to me be the most practical approach to existence, to defining and discovering reality. So if there's some ultimate truth or ultimate reality out there, I'm wondering what justification they have for presuming one, or
well, I think that
getting
depends.
to discover one. I guess.
That depends on what they're calling an ultimate truth and what you're calling an ultimate truth. Because, and I'm not saying it's different things. I'm just saying it just depends on what you're calling it.
Yeah, it's gonna be different in each of the different religions.
Like with Taoism, it's just so general as far as just go with whatever is natural, but he doesn't define what's natural. But he does say think a lot about this before you do it. Before you act, think about why you're acting. Think about what is good and what is not good. Not in the sense of good and evil, but what is necessary versus not necessary. Do you really have to do this, or is this something that ask yourself why you're doing it, ask yourself what your motives are, and if you determine that, if you've examined it, you determine it's the right course of action, take that course of action. But then when
and I think for the most part those are all things that I would advocate. I just don't, I'm wondering what it is about some of these that distinguish them as a religion or as a philosophy or as a belief.
That's a good question. I mean, I really don't know. And like with Buddhism, you have really all that, to me anyway, when I look at that religion, it's simply a response to personal pain. It's saying there are so many people that do things that hurt themselves, and if they only knew what they were doing to themselves, they could avoid a lot of pain. And so Buddhism really is just an attempt to help people cope with that. Some people hurt themselves more than other people. And it's potential that a person who, for example, hurts themselves a lot. Everyone knows people that are self-destructive people.
Sure.
And if you don't know them personally, you see them on television, somebody that you're like, oh, I feel so sorry for, or even, actors or actresses, you'll see like Britney Spears, and it's just so sad. You've got this beautiful young woman and she just seems to be on this downward spiral, and you can't help but
Compare her to Lindsay Lohan.
It's like she has such potential there to do whatever she wants to do with herself, and when you see her, it's just she's this tabloid joke, and it's just very sad to see that happening to somebody that has that kind of potential that a lot of other people don't have. I mean, she has the money, she has the connections, she could go and get whatever help she needs to get, and yet she's burning her bridges and doing. And then you see other people that are fighting so hard to keep it together in situations where they're maybe being raised with abusive parents, and they don't have those resources, and yet they're struggling just to have a normal life. There are so many things in the world that can cause pain for people. And the story goes that that's what Buddha was addressing. He was seeing this pain in the world and saying, what is the cause of this? And when he examined it, he came to the determination that the main reason that most of us hurt ourselves is because of unrealistic attachments. So he was just like, you get attached to this man and he beats you. Maybe you need to not be attached to this man. Maybe you need to get over this emotional, connection to this person. If you could just get past that emotional need to be with this guy who's hitting you, then you could release that. And that's where Taoism is saying, let it go. Just let it go. Don't keep trying to fix him. Understand that he's dangerous, that you don't need to be living with him. And the best course of action in this case is to let the relationship go and just detach yourself from it, get away from this. And in that sense, it's almost like an action and an inaction, because you're like dropping your emotional action of wanting to make it work, but you're taking the action of leaving the abusive situation. So, I mean, it kind of just comes to the question of, and like with Buddhism, it's going to, like I say, it's going to speak more to somebody that's in a painful situation. Somebody who isn't hurting themselves that much might look at it and say, why is this so important? Someone who is hurting themselves consistently or in a cycle of abusive situations is going to look at that and say, oh my God, this is just changing the way I look at things, and it might save them from a, potentially harmful situation. But it's going to represent a huge truth to somebody like that, but a much more minor truth, or maybe even a mundane one, to somebody who already knows this. You know what I mean? So
yeah, it's just when I start looking at phrases from BeliefNet or wherever, where they start talking about ultimate reality, and it almost seems to be self-contradictory. On the one hand, we talked about earlier the idea of the nameless, and the idea that when we go to label things, we label things based on their attributes, based on characteristics that we understand or things that we grasp, and that in fact, whatever it is that they're ultimately talking about, whether it's whether they want to almost label it as an ultimate reality or call it the nameless or whatever else, those two things seem to be in contradiction. That on the one hand, they're saying you can't really understand this; it's beyond it. I'm wondering what is the purpose of addressing kind of a potential ultimate reality or grand unification in any of this. I guess. Well,
again, bear in mind, he didn't have laws of physics. We understand a whole lot more about the universe and the world. We see it, and it's not very mystical to us.
And I think that's one of my primary objections with what I see with these various New Age movements and some problems with Eastern religion. Now, on a fundamental level, most of these Eastern religions, I don't really have a big beef with at all. I don't adhere to them. I'm not quite sure I understand why anybody would, but it may be that different strokes for different folks. I'm going to look at the world in a different way and learn things differently. But I do have some objections to this idea that seems to be pervasive across. And I'm not picking on anyone in particular, but this idea that there was this ancient wisdom that was all discovered thousands of years ago, and we've lost it, so now we must get back to this. There may be a few odds and ends that fell through the cracks of history, but I have a difficult time believing that a lot of it has to do with sample size and human interactions, and considering that the world population now exceeds any time in the previous history, and the number of interactions are greater, that if we're going to come to an understanding about what humans are, we should be studying now, and not what some people living in the desert learned 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, because based on what some of their writings are, they definitely got bits of it wrong. The Earth isn't flat. It's not at the center of the universe.
I think that's one of the things I admired about the Tao Te Ching, though, is the idea that it seemed to me like he was doing his best to describe what he was seeing without really knowing what was behind it.
Yeah.
And that's
and
tough.
I do get that. And I realize that, once upon a time I would have looked at all this, whether it would be, bits from the Tao Te Ching or Buddhist koans, as, oh, that's just Eastern mysticism mumbo jumbo. It's not supposed to make any sense to you. It's this pretentious nonsense. And if you meditate on this particular poem, maybe you know. But now I look at it and say, okay, if there is in fact anything at all to this, it's much more probable that these types of poetic, skewed views of reality promote a different type of thinking, of viewing things
Right.
within an individual. So that while it may in fact be mumbo jumbo, it may in fact also be useful mumbo jumbo, in that it, you know, how many times have you been in a situation where somebody has said something that caused you to look at an item or a situation in a completely different light, and you learned something new about it? We've had the same thing when you did your episode on religious experiences within drug use.
Right.
The drug use is something that promotes this idea that I can look at something from a new direction,
Right.
and come to some understanding. And it may be that even just this a nonsensical stream of syllables might provoke the same thing. And so rather than you know, disrespecting all these people and saying, oh, it's just mumbo jumbo, my focus has always been on, okay, whether or not it's mumbo jumbo, is it actually useful, and does it lead you to a better understanding of your reality? And if so, great, cool.
Right.
But I'd really, you know, rather than wasting all my time on it, if it's not going to work, I'd kind of like better answers
Right.
about what people have learned.
Okay.
So what other comments?
Well,
We've
let's
got
go
like
on.
eight minutes
This is
left.
from Texas Taoist, and he wrote, I have an idea that nature provides each creature with a built-in operating system, not unlike a computer's original operating system. Society loads its software on top of our natural operating system until eventually we find it difficult to distinguish our original operating system from the software. Following one's Tao means performing a system analysis upon yourself to discover your original operating system that is still working deep behind the scene of all the software. What struck me about this particular interpretation was how close it was to the consciousness models that talked about the genetic brain structure and how we impose social structure onto that. And that was just what he reminded me of, the idea that you have your sort of biological structure where you're geared toward this because of evolution, and then you have whatever society imposes on that. And when you were talking about the collector, that's what this reminds me of. You know, it would depend if the guy is collecting because of social imposition, then that would not be considered going with his Tao. But if he's down to the core, and if he stripped it down and says, I understand who I am at the core, and I still like collecting teapots, that would not be, you know, anti-Tao.
See, and I disagree with the entire paragraph on just a fundamental level, start to finish.
Okay.
Because the analogy kind of breaks down in that he starts with, I have an idea that nature provides each creature with a built-in operating system. No, it doesn't. Who you are is something that develops and progresses based on everything that happened. If you went back to infancy, you don't have an operating system that necessarily dictates what your desires are going to be, what your wants are going to be, what your interests are. This idea that society loads its software on top of that, and that following one's Tao means performing an analysis to discover the underlying software. I don't see that. It would be, to me, that's...
But you do believe that there is, for example, common human evolutionary need that stems from our brain function. Like, for example, you will have a desire to eat.
Sure.
And that's built in.
Sure.
Now, what you like is going to be socially defined because it can be limited only to what you've tried, correct? I feel like chocolate cake.
Sure.
Well, because you've had chocolate cake, because your culture eats chocolate cake, but somewhere else maybe they've never heard of chocolate cake, so they don't have that as an option.
Right.
So
when he starts talking about getting back to the core operating system, if you're talking about getting back to the fact that you know, there is some low-level reptile brain evolved traits, okay, I have no problem at all recognizing.
No, and I might be misunderstanding him. What I was taking this to say is that it's good to strip it down, to sort of strip out those social layers. Here's my social biases. It doesn't mean that to not have them. It just simply means recognize them as social biases and then understand that there's like a really core base operating system that's like your natural raw brain function, and then you have these things that are built on top of that.
Right, but those natural raw brain functions are things like eat,
Right.
sleep,
Right.
breathe, have sex.
But Taoism is based on simplicity. So yeah, it's going to be very simple. There's not going to be, and the other thing is it doesn't deal with those things that clutter that come beyond that. It's going to deal with the very basic stuff, and that's where it starts to back off and say, beyond this, sort of your personal call. We're not telling you whether or not you need to be gay. We're not telling you whether or not to go and have a baby. This book is just telling you, here's the basic nature, and then you need to figure out what to do with your life.
Yeah, what I'm saying in his final sentence where he says, following one's Tao means performing a system analysis upon yourself to discover your original operating system. If we extend the analogy to where the original operating system is eat, sleep, breathe, have sex, then, okay, I'm following my Tao. Because I already recognize that a fundamental level of operating system is there, and I didn't need to read any books or perform any self-reflection to find it.
You're taking it a step, though. You're putting in a step that he doesn't have in there, because what he's not advocating living according only to that system.
That's what I'm saying. He's saying recognize that that part of us is still there.
Right.
I recognize that without any self-reflection, without any.
Some people don't, though.
Well,
I mean, there are some people who believe that it's inherent in them to do something that is socially imposed.
All right.
And what he's saying is strip it down and become aware of what is choice and what is not your choice, what is just your raw nature. That's how I'm interpreting him. But again, maybe that's not what
we don't want to beat this guy up forever because he might have discovered some hidden truth.
I want to skip to the last one because I'm not sure we'll have time. Yeah.
You have a minute.
How a Taoist faces life's changes without hope of an afterlife. And I felt like this was important because a lot of Christians especially will call in and ask, how do you deal with not believing in an afterlife, or do you really not believe in an afterlife? Well, this is an example of a Taoist who wanted to kill himself and then came to the Taoist conclusion that he shouldn't do it. And this is what his reasoning was. A few times when my spiritual spark has been the dimmest, I have considered ending my life. Once after work, while driving home, I had a thought that it would be so much easier to slam the car at 80 miles per hour into the highway wall. It would have been quick and simple death. Yet at that moment, Taoist beliefs kicked in, and I shook my head, realizing if things were that bad, I could just walk away from the problem. The next morning, I started the process to close down the project I was working on. Then each day, in a journey 7 years long, I moved each morning into a new life. It was a process of weaving 7 years of aspirations and dozens of distinct changes together as a whole to recreate myself. Yes, it would have been quicker and easier to end my life, a matter of a mere 7 seconds as compared to 7 years, but my life will end eventually, so why rush into it? I look forward to the time when I will fade. However, until then, I enjoy life, hug the sadness, celebrate the happiness, circle and embrace all aspects of being alive. And he also says to go with the flow doesn't mean to do what's easiest. It means to be true to your nature. We often have to deal with rough times and a more difficult path to be true to our nature. And I would agree with his assessment.
Yeah, I guess there's just a problem about what level we define the nature. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We only got a few seconds left. We'll be going to IHOP at I-35, and Cesar Chavez, as always, will be there in about 30 minutes. We'll be back next week, and I don't know what happened, whether it was football or what, but we didn't get any calls today, and we'll see if we have that problem next week.
At least I got through most of my...